Okay, now that we're here, I need you to know about the employee ownership ecosystem. And it's just a refresher. I'm talking about broad-based employee ownership, where all of the workers at an organization share in the ownership of the company. There it is. Now, when I talk about the ecosystem, I'm not talking about any one organization or one lane. An ecosystem is an interconnected web of organizations and individuals who are doing work to build and grow this movement. And as in any movement, this one depends on many different people in many different roles, doing many different things, which means that there are many different ways that you could plug in. So here's a quick tour, sort of by cluster, and I'm not gonna be able to cover all the organizations. I'm just gonna do kind of the high level ones. And this is gonna follow probably a little bit of my learning journey, because this is how I came into the space. When I first started learning about employee ownership, I wanted to start sort of big tent, big idea. Where are the top organizations that are educating, building awareness, and kind of producing the research around this movement? And those include the National Center for Employee Ownership, NCEO, which is a nonprofit organization that educates about all forms of employee ownership. They also have a membership that you can join if you're an employee-owned company. They've got a lot of employee-owned companies that are members, and they also provide a ton of resources for sort of once you become an employee-owned company, this is what that journey looks like. Then there's the Rutgers Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing at Rutgers University. They have a huge library of resources. If you're an academic or like a research nerd, you can like lose yourself there for weeks and weeks and weeks on end. And they've produced a lot of research about the benefits of employee ownership. Don't forget to watch that testimony that was given at the Senate hearing in July. And then also in terms of education and awareness building, if you're talking about just building awareness about employee ownership, there's a great organization called the Employee Ownership Expansion Network, which is a national nonprofit that really only exists to build more awareness of it, because it's one of the biggest challenges facing this field is not enough people know about it. And they've also helped to incubate a lot of state centers of employee ownership. There are pre-existing state centers as well, so about half of our states have a nonprofit state center of employee ownership. And if you live in one of those states, that's where you can go to learn about what is happening from an employee ownership education and awareness standpoint in your own state. There's a map that you can find on eoxnetwork.org that lists all the state centers. Great place to start. Also sort of in this education, awareness building, and research, but also organizations that in addition do sort of field building work, think tank type work, and maybe even some technical assistance. There are some orgs that blend through these spaces. A few that come to mind are the Democracy at Work Institute and their sister organization, the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. They specifically look at worker cooperatives and cooperative development work, but they are a great resource. And then there's also Project Equity. I did some early work with Project Equity from a workforce standpoint, and they've done a lot of work in terms of research, publications, and awareness building, but they also offer direct technical assistance like feasibility studies for companies that might be wanting to explore whether this is right for them. Speaking about feasibility studies, there's a whole suite of technical assistance providers that focus on this kind of conversion place. For businesses that are existing that want to become employee-owned companies, there's a whole journey for you to explore, and we'll definitely be producing more content on that in the future to help demystify that navigational journey. But those technical assistance providers, and I've named one of them, there are many more. They do everything from doing this early feasibility study, like is employee ownership right for you and your company? Do you need to do a few things first to get your company ready? Which form of employee ownership is right for your company? What are your goals? I mean, really, we should start with that. What are your goals for sharing ownership? And there are a whole bunch of technical assistance providers that can support with that, from feasibility studies to valuation to sourcing capital and investment. And then that is really designed to help buy out the owner of a company and transition that ownership to the employees of the company without the employees having to buy in with their own money. So there are quite a few loan funds, as well as conversion capital, investment like buyout funds, and all sorts of stuff on the finance side, which needs its own video. What else? A lot of the startup ecosystem has been doing work, and so the Democracy at Work Institute has done some work here. There's Seed Commons, which does financing for starting new worker cooperatives, and there's a cool organization called Start.coop that also helps to incubate worker cooperatives. So there's some really fun stuff that's happening in that space as well, and I can chat more about that at some point. The other things to think about is that while a lot of these organizations, especially the awareness building and the research and the field building organizations, focused on all forms of employee ownership and building awareness about everything, soup to nuts. There are model-specific technical assistance providers as well, and that's largely in, three main categories, but there are some emerging areas. One is the employee stock ownership plans, or ESOPs. There's the ESOP Association. There's also ESCA, which stands for Employee-Owned S-Corps of America. And then there are various technical assistance providers. Then there's worker cooperative specific organizations. I mentioned Democracy at Work Institute. The U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops is a really important organization in that space. And then there are some cool organizations like Seed Commons that provides financing and startup capital, non-extractive financing specifically to worker cooperatives. And then there's kind of this more emerging model that is built around a purpose trust, where the trust benefits employees. And so it's commonly referred to as an employee-owned trust, employee ownership trust. There are a few organizations that are working on expanding knowledge in that space. I haven't even touched on policy makers and policy organizations, but at the state and federal level, there are organizations that are advocating for greater expansion of policy. It's worth mentioning that there are also some other spaces that are kind of in and around employee ownership, and these spaces are expanding, and there are organizations that are building bridges between what we would call sort of broad-based employee ownership and enduring employee ownership with other ways of sharing equity, of sharing profit sharing with their employees, of sharing employer owner type benefits that don't actually transfer ownership. Employee ownership trusts actually kind of fall in that category because it's a trust that benefits the employees, even though there's no actual employee ownership in that model. But then there are also new models that really focus more on a profit sharing model, or they might be doing sort of temporary ownership as they go through a growth and buyout, mergers and acquisitions phase. And sometimes that ownership continues with the new buyer, sometimes it doesn't. And so these are all ongoing conversations and different ways to get involved and start exploring. And then lastly, most of my journey into the employee ownership space has been focused on awareness building, education, and sort of helping businesses consider that converting to an employee-owned company. But once a business becomes employee-owned, then there's a whole suite of ecosystem partners that support employee-owned companies with their specific needs, whether that be financing, trustees, communications, employee engagement, building ownership culture, and the work that is there to help employees begin to take on that mantle of ownership and begin to realize those benefits that in turn create productive companies and build wealth for everyone. That's all I have for now. I know I didn't name everyone in this ecosystem, and it was probably absolutely preferenced by the journey that I have, so that's my caveat. If you want to see a more expansive ecosystem map, or if you are in the EO ecosystem and you want to see yourself in this map, why don't you let me know, because I think it's really important that we have as much transparency around this journey to help business owners and workers navigate this path. So that's an intro for those of you who are in this professional space and wanted a high-level overview of the employee ownership ecosystem. The field is still forming. You don't have to be an expert to get involved. Just be curious and be ready to contribute. And that's what we're going to cover in our next video.